for the Confederacy. They're running out of men, they're running out of food, they put up a gallant effort, but time is not on their side. So that'll take us to our subtopic today, which is the surrender of both Petersburg and Richmond. Surrender of both Petersburg and Richmond. Now, we told you before that the plan was that Union General Sherman was going to march to the sea and then make his way up toward Virginia, and he was going to pinch with Grant's forces at Richmond. So as General Sherman was marching closer and closer to Richmond from the south, Confederate General Lee's troops are getting thinner and thinner. Okay? Remember the population difference when we first started talking about this between the North and the South? That's really catching up with the South at this point. And even though the Union's losing many more casualties in battle, as I mentioned yesterday, at this point, any casualty by the South is a problem for them. Well, one of General Grant's kind of right-hand men in the Virginia campaigns, was a Union general by the name of Philip Sheridan. And you'll hear a lot more about Philip Sheridan when we get into Native Americans. Okay, he'll become a very household name. But a man under Grant's campaign in the Virginia campaigns was Union General Philip Sheridan. And he and Grant were really closing in on Richmond from the north as Sherman was approaching Richmond from the south. So basically they're pinching Richmond and they're going to surround Richmond and force the Confederates' hand. So, as the Union General Sherman was marching closer and closer to Richmond from the south, Confederate General Lee's troops are getting thinner and thinner, and Union General Philip Sheridan, along with General Grant and the Union Army, were closing in on Richmond from the north while Sherman was making his assault from the south. So they're basically going to surround Richmond. Well, the first town or city close to Richmond that had to be abandoned by General Lee was Petersburg, Virginia. And since they were low on food and soldiers, General Lee was forced to abandon Petersburg in early April of 1865. So Lee abandons and basically surrenders Petersburg to Union forces in early April of 1865. The next target for the Union will be what? After they captured Richmond, okay? And just a few days later, after capturing Petersburg, General Lee was forced to surrender the Confederate capital of Richmond. So just a few days later, General Lee was forced to surrender the Confederate capital of Richmond. Now, this was kind of self-destructive, but when he surrendered Richmond, General Lee ordered his soldiers to set fire to anything that he thought the Union would want or use. So before leaving Richmond, they basically started the Confederate capital on fire. The Confederates did, under Lee's orders, because he didn't want anything left that the Union would want or the Union would use. So finally, after 4 long years of fighting, the Union finally has captured the Confederate capital of Richmond. 4 years it took them to do it. That will take us to our next subtopic then, which is the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. The Confederate surrender at Appomattox. Well, obviously, and I think you kids can figure this out, after Lee surrendered Richmond, he had no choice but to surrender the entire Confederacy at that point. And on April 7th of 1865, April 7th of 1865, that is the date in which General Grant officially asked General Lee to surrender. On April 7th, 1865 is the official date in which General Grant of the Union officially asked Confederate General Robert E. Lee to surrender. He asked him on April 7th. Between April 7th and April 9th, which the Confederacy is surrendered, what do you think they did? What do you think Grant and Lee did those 2 days prior to the surrender? From the time He asked him to surrender to the time that Lee surrendered. What did they do during that time? They negotiated the terms of surrender, which is different than a treaty. You got a good point there, Dalton, but it's different. Terms of surrender is what we're going to allow you to do if you surrender to us, if anything. A treaty is something that ends a war that kind of splits up things. There really isn't going to be a treaty here. There's simply going to be terms of surrender. Now, do you remember anything about Grant from earlier? Yeah. What was it? Unconditional surrender Grant. So a lot of people thought Grant would be pretty harsh towards Lee, and he actually was not. We'll talk about that. So on April 9th, 1865, after 2 days of thought and preparation, General Lee agreed to General Grant's terms of surrender. We'll tell you what those are in a bit. So on April 9th, 1865, after Lee thought for 2 days and prepared himself and his men, he agreed on April 9th, 1865, to surrender under Grant's terms of surrender. So on that same date of April 9th, 1865, these two great Civil War generals met at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. So on April 9th, 1865, these two great Civil War generals, General Ulysses S. Grant and General Robert E. Lee, meet at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Now, here's the difference in attire between the two generals when they met to sign the terms of surrender. Lee was in full dress uniform. He had a jeweled, studded sword at his side. He was surrendering with dignity and honor in full dress uniform, had a very fancy jeweled, studded sword at his side, and he came to surrender. Grant, just the opposite. He wore a private shirt, a shirt a private would wear. It was unbuttoned at the neck, looked kind of scruffy, and he had muddy boots. So he did not dress up at all for this. Okay, he was dressed in a private shirt, unbuttoned at the top, which was normally not how it was done, and he wore muddy boots. Whereas Lee was in full dress uniform, looking sharp as could be, with a jewel-studded sword at his side. Well, General Grant, along with his military secretary, Eli Samuel Parker, drafted the terms of surrender for Lee to sign. So General Grant, along with his military secretary, Eli Samuel Parker, drafted the terms of surrender that they would have General Lee sign. And the terms of surrender were very simple, very honorable, and consisted of these three things. So General Grant's terms of surrender were very simple, and they were very honorable. And here were the three terms. First of all, the defeated Confederates would be required to sign pledges promising not to fight against the Union any longer. This is the first term of surrender. That the defeated Confederates would be required to sign pledges promising not to fight against the Union any longer. Second term of surrender was that the Confederate soldiers were required to surrender their weapons. Confederate soldiers were required to surrender their weapons. However, the third condition was that General Grant allowed Confederate officers to keep their pistols and their swords. Okay? He let Confederate officers keep their pistols and their swords. So the terms of surrender were simple and honorable. Number one, the defeated Confederates would be required to sign pledges promising not to fight against the Union any longer. Number two, the Confederate soldiers were required to surrender their weapons. And number three, General Grant did allow the Confederate officers to keep their pistols and swords. Another thing that wasn't in the terms of surrender, but Grant allowed, that any Confederate who had a horse or mule that they were using in battle, he allowed them to keep them. And he was quoted as saying, "Let all the men who claim to own a horse or mule take the animals home with them to work their little farms." So he felt that these people would need a start, so he let all Confederate soldiers and officers keep their horses or mules that they had used during the war. Didn't make them be on foot. And his quote was, "Let all of the men who claim to own a horse or mule take the animals home with them to work their little farms." So he allowed all Confederates to keep their horses or mules. Well, after these terms were announced and presented to Robert E. Lee, the proud general surrendered to General Grant. So after these terms of surrender were announced and agreed upon, the very proud General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. When the meeting ended, you got to picture this, General Lee was not there by himself. He had a lot of regular soldiers around him that were willing to fight to the death, even though they knew they were defeated. And they stood around him and said, "General, we'll fight on, we'll fight on." And he makes a comment, "No, we're basically done here. Thank you for your service." So when the meeting ended, Lee mounted his horse, Traveler, and simply rode off. And again, his men, as he rode off, said, "General Lee, are we surrendered?" "Yes, you are, men." "No, we'll fight on, we'll fight on." "No, men, I put you through too much now. You are surrendered." Basically is what happened. And Lee rode off on his horse. Well, there were a lot of Union troops there that were surrounding the Appomattox courthouse area. And what do you think they did as Lee rode off? As you might do if you win a basketball game, because you're so excited as the other team leaves the floor. What might you be doing? Cheering and yay and this and that and whatever. So Union troops started to cheer, and Grant ordered them to be silent. Grant ordered them to be silent. So Union troops, after seeing the surrender and watching Robert E. Lee ride off in his horse Traveler, Union troops began to cheer, and Grant ordered them to be silent. Also, there was some nearby cannon fire that the word hadn't gotten out to the one artillery unit that this was happening. So you could hear in the background cannon fire still, where the Union was firing into Richmond. Okay? And after he stopped the Union cheering, General Lee stated publicly, he said, "Tell them to stop that racket. The Southerners have surrendered. I see no reason to embarrass them further." So there was cannon fire, Union cannon fire in the distance. And when Grant noticed that after the surrender, he said, "Tell them to stop that racket. The Southerners have surrendered. I see no reason to embarrass them further." Okay? There's your surrender. Which will take us to our next subtopic, short one, final effects of the Civil War. Final effects of the Civil War. Now you're going to see this better when I show you this movie called The Blue and the Gray after we test. It's a great movie, fictional, but very accurate as far as how families work. So, with the surrender at Appomattox, the Civil War in America had finally come to an end. And families on both sides of the conflict, North and South, would now try to reunite to grieve the loss of their loved ones. There are very few families that were not affected by this war, somehow or another. Now listen to this. Civil War historians have noted that all families, regardless of which side they fought on in the Civil War, felt the tragic effects of losing a loved one. Probably not a family on either side didn't lose someone from their family as a result of the Civil War. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. Pretty darn amazing. And casualties were just absolutely devastating on both sides, which we'll talk about next. However, I want to kind of talk about the Outlaw Josey Wales a little bit. How many people have seen that movie, The Outlaw Josey Wales? Okay, you probably should watch it. It's an old Clint Eastwood movie. And basically what happens is, even though Lee surrendered, there were some renegade Southerners who were willing to quit. And the Union continued and continued and continued for quite a period of time after the surrender at Appomattox to try to rope these people in and get them back on track. Well, if you watch Outlaw Josey Wales, that's what he is. He's one of these Southern soldiers who has refused to give up the ghost. Well, anyway, they're trying to negotiate with these soldiers and get them back in, so they're sending out representatives to talk to these renegade leaders who haven't surrendered and said, hey, you know, we're going to give you the same deal. Okay, you got to turn over your weapons, you got to sign a pledge or state in your oath that you will not fight, we'll let you keep your horses, blah, 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 and we'll even feed you. So Josey Wales and his renegades come into this Union surrender camp, for lack of a better term, and they soon find out that it's not the intention of the Union to have them surrender, it's the intention of the Union to execute all of these guys because they're mad at them because they have been out doing renegade stuff after the surrender. Well, Josey Wales figures that out because he just decides he's not going to go in. He says, men, you go ahead and go in. I can't do it. They go in, a bunch of them get shot up. One guy, young kid, doesn't get shot up, and he ends up coming back, and that becomes the story. If you're bored, get on Netflix and watch The Outlaw Josey Wales. It will make sense to you in perspective to this particular class. I think you'd enjoy it. Okay? All right, let's talk about the casualties of the Civil War. Talk about Union losses first. Union losses. The total casualties for the Union in the Civil War were 634,703. This is just the Union side.
You should write that on the board.
Okay, 634,703 casualties. That's incredible. That would be killed in action, wounded, or death resulting from being wounded. In other words, killed in action, you're killed in the battle. Death results means you were wounded and later died of your injuries. And wounded is just wounded and you survive. 634,703. That's just, to me, incredible. That's just the Union side. The Confederate side, total casualties, 335,524. 335,524 casualties. Now, let's break out the Union casualties by how they died. Killed in action, 110,070. KIA, killed in action, killed on the battlefield. 249,458 died as a result of their injuries. Or you think maybe some of them committed suicide like that captain did on Battery B when he saw that he was going to get, okay? And wounded 275,175. That's just on the Union side. These are wounded. 275,175. On the Confederate side, killed in action, 74,524 KIA. Deaths, 124,000. And wounded, 137,000. Now, whenever you get these round numbers like 137,000, 124,000, what's that really telling you? Not real sure. So are these 100% accurate? Probably not. But you take a look at it, it's pretty amazing. So now you can write these down. You know what the total Civil War casualties were? 970,227. 970,227. It's incredible. It's almost 1 million people. Killed in action, you can add them up, 184, 594, KIA, these are totals, 373, 458, deaths, and 412, 175 wounded. That's just incredible. Now, just the KIA themselves on both sides and the people that died as a result, not counting the wounded, represented 10% of the country's population at the time. So you probably had 20% of the entire population of the United States that were either killed, died as a result of, or were wounded in the Civil War. 20% of your entire population. I mean, it was just an incredible loss of life, fighting between people of the same country. Seems amazing to me. Seems amazing. Look at that. We probably aren't going to ask you all those statistics on the test. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little review now because we're going to have a quiz on Monday. And I'll tell you what you need to know. The quiz on Monday will tell you what you need to know, okay? You ready? Those people that will see if they get on the website here. Yeah, see if we're ready. Okay, here we go. Olivia, tell me who the Republican nominee for vice president was in the election of 1864. Andrew Johnson. Yeah, don't do what I did and say Andrew Jackson. Andrew Johnson. Very good.